I think you have to separate them into probably about three different containers to understand it. First of all, there are the technical talks that are going. We're just about to have the fourth, I think, series of talks. And that's, in fact, there's nothing new really going on in that. In one respect, all the issues that have come up, like should Iran import enriched uranium instead of enriching inside Iran? Should the Russians be providing energy, if you like, for Iranian industry? How should all of these technical things, should enriched uranium be exported out of the country to Russia, like happened during the early part? All those things we've been through. And we're really just going around the same old treadmill on these same issues at the moment within the talks. They're looking for some new way of presenting it that will allow Trump to present it as not the same as the old, if you like, JCPOA, because that has a bad reputation in Washington. A warmed up Obama JCPOA would get a thumbs down in most of Washington and Congress, and certainly in Israel. So that's one component, if you like, compartment to this element. The second compartment really is that this touches on a deep division within the United States, and that's quite complicated. There is a large constituency that supports Israel, as we all know, in Israel. But there's a constituency which we call the deep state, and this has deep structures that are untouchable in American politics. And one of them is support for Israel. Bipartisan, you're not allowed to discuss it even in presidential elections. And so that element of the deep state plus a sort of conventional thinking in the Pentagon, which has existed, if you like, since the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was, the end of history, the triumph of the liberal order. And for them, it's a sort of colonial aspect to this, too. And then the last one, of course, is Israel itself. Netanyahu, this has been a campaign of Netanyahu and his father, by the way, but from Netanyahu for 25 years, that Iran must be, if you like, neutered. Either on the Libyan model, where you just rip out everything of the uranium enrichment infrastructure in Iran, leave them with nothing, empty, and then tackle their ballistic missiles and tackle all support for Hezbollah and the other parties. That's what he would like to see, is a completely neutered Iran. There is an element too, but it's not so clear, that we've had even from Witkoff, who I think is a fairly accurate reflector of what Trump's thinking. In his discussion with Tucker Carlson, he said, look, the whole of the Middle East is slowly normalizing with Israel. And the real problem is at the top with Iran and its existential threat by its support for Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, etc. Now, if we could only get rid of that, he didn't say how, get rid of that, wouldn't that be epic? It would be a new Middle East. He didn't say it, but of course, and we would get the oil and gas in the Middle East too. But I mean, so there is a vision, if you like, that the new Middle East requires, however it's achieved, the neutralization of Iran.
Well, this is a great point, though. If it doesn't seem as if there's a clear consensus even within the United States what they want. I watched recently Donald Trump argue that there has to be the complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. Then Marco Rubio comes and says, well, we have to limit the enrichment, but they can still have a civilian nuclear program. at the same time, we're hearing now nuclear discussions being linked to limiting the ballistic missiles of Iran, and also for Iran to give up the entire resistance, which is, I think if anyone has been to Iran, you see how, that this is a non-starter. But what do you see the Americans actually going after? Do you see the same divisions as Alistair Crook suggested?
Yes, I think that divisions inside the United States are very important, and I think it's fair to say that the chances for success will not necessarily be very high because of what's going on inside Washington. Not only Trump is constantly flip-flopping, and in his recent interview, we saw him say two things almost simultaneously. He spoke about removing the whole program, and then he said, "I'm willing to listen to the argument for." So he's saying literally two things at the same time. So these constant U-turns and flip-flops, I think, show that the situation in Washington is chaotic, and it's not just the Iranian nuclear negotiations. It's the tariff war, it's the trade war. We see the United States constantly shifting its position. In Ukraine, we saw how Trump had a mandate. He could have ended the war literally on day one, because that's what he spoke of during the months prior to the election. But he didn't, and I think that's a sign of his weakness. So it's not just the divisions, but I think it's a sign that Trump really isn't a very powerful and strong president. Because, as I was saying, he could have stopped the Ukraine war literally days after he came to power. He could have said, "This is not my war, this is Biden's war," as he keeps saying, even though we know that he was deeply involved in creating this crisis during his first presidency. But he could have said, "This is not my war, I'm ending it, and I'm moving on to something else." But he didn't. And so now, after over 100 days, we see that the United States is beginning to revive its military support for Ukraine. That, I think, is something that people in Iran are monitoring. They're saying that, well, if he's that weak, then how is he going to be able to be steadfast when it comes to negotiating with us? And then there's the issue of the negotiations over Gaza. That was his ceasefire. It wasn't Obama's, it wasn't Biden's, where he could say it was the worst agreement in the world. Witkoff was behind the talks. We heard that he read the riot act to Netanyahu on a Saturday afternoon. But then literally after the ceasefire was enforced, and literally days after, a couple of weeks after, he spoke about ethnic cleansing and that the Palestinians must be removed. So the first, second, third phase of this ceasefire, which was all negotiated and agreed upon, suddenly all went out the window. So on the one hand, we see a weak Trump. On the other hand, we see a Trump that constantly flip-flops. And also we see a Trump who does not abide or respect his own agreements, because Witkoff is his man. So for the Iranian side, the question is, which Trump? And even if Trump does sign an agreement, let's say there is somehow an agreement negotiated, who's to say that we won't wake up in the morning and we'll see something on Truth Social where Trump says, I'm not going to do this anymore?
Well, I like the comparison because we do see the same in Ukraine. Trump has two men. He has Witkoff, which seems to recognize the Russian security concern. Then he has Kellogg. Now, with Iran, you see similar, I guess, indecision. Some suggest that it's time to remove Iran as seen as being the key problem, while others think they can make a deal. But within this, I guess, weak presidency of Trump, to what extent do you see Israel being able to swing, or do they want to swing the United States towards war? And do you see them being successful towards this end?
It's much more than indecision in the Trump team. There is indecision. But it is really, when it comes to the negotiations in Ukraine with Russia, it is something much more profound. There is no sustaining if you like, team that does the work that should be done in any professional, if you like, government, of examining the processes and devising a strategy. There was no strategy. We came across, and just before the election, it seems that Kellogg put forward his strategy, which was just to copy the Korean practice, that where let's have a ceasefire, political discussions, later, afterwards, and tried to implement the same thing on Russia. Let's have a ceasefire. Now, I've been involved in a number of ceasefires negotiations. They're complex things that to provide. You've got to make provision for when it breaks down. It will break down. How are you going to manage that? What happens then? How is it going to affect the talks? And none of this was done. I mean, they go like, rather, can I say it, rather naively, to Riyadh and think that you just sort of flick your fingers and a ceasefire comes into being, and then you put pressure on Putin to do the same. But has no one listened to what Putin said on the 14th of January of last year when he gave the speech to the foreign ministry, and he said very clearly, this is the conditions for a ceasefire. It involves the 4 oblasts that are now part of the Russian state. They are not going to be, they have to be evacuated from Ukraine. That is the start of a ceasefire. And he's had it repeated, and Lavrov, the foreign minister, has repeated it endlessly. It seems as if it was never heard. So when Witkoff comes back from Moscow, after several discussions, personal, one-to-one with Putin, and he comes and reports back to Trump, and he says, look, this is what Putin is saying. We actually have to have a political framework first, not later. That is, the political framework brings about the ceasefire. And then the political framework can be elaborated in that context afterwards. But without a framework, without a basic understanding, you can't do this. So Witkoff laid all this out at the meeting, Trump. And what happened? Kellogg get up and said, the Ukrainians will never buy that. And what did Trump say? Nothing. He didn't respond. And he left it unsaid and undecided. And this is the problem, is the lack of strategy and the lack of backup. Did no one tell Kellogg, do some work on what Putin and Lavrov have been saying about the terms of a ceasefire before we go plunging into an attempt to have a ceasefire? Seems not. They didn't do it. Didn't anyone say, you have to do due diligence? Is the Korean model the right model? No, that wasn't done either. And this is really what's causing the problem in Moscow. Putin would like to get to a normalization of relations, but on the right terms, which is, in fact, a big picture strategic agreement, which could include even nuclear weapons and arms limitation. Anything could go into that. But of course, that wasn't what was put on the table. And so it is this failure by Trump to actually show that he will make a decision when it comes to the point, and that he's able to impose it or enforce it within his team, and much more importantly, within the Pentagon, where there are big divisions about, and people there who genuinely, maybe wrong-headedly, but in the bureaucracy of the Pentagon, believe they are trying to save America from Trump. And then he has also the Europeans who are doing whatever they can to disrupt Trump. They hope they can disrupt him as much as possible, and that he will be weakened completely by the midterms. And so they are acting strongly against him. Putin is also waiting to see, why doesn't Trump tell the Europeans, get out, this is not your business, I'm doing this. And why doesn't he tell everyone, and this would be most important, okay, the ceasefire, Mr. Trump, if a ceasefire is started, are you going to continue to supply weapons? Are you going to share intelligence? Mr. Trump, President Trump, has not even given those understandings after a ceasefire has been implemented, that there won't be weapons supply, there won't be intelligence sharing. I mean, you can't run ceasefires in these terms, where one side is stopping action and then another side decides to get, I'm going to start rearming and getting more intelligence so that I can strike Russia more effectively. This is the problem, and it's the same for Iran. You've just said no one really knows what the position is. Has he sorted it out? He had a member of his team, Walz, who's now been dismissed, for doing a different policy, it seems. That's what the Washington Post describes in their own article, saying that Walz was privately having discussions with Netanyahu about an attack on Iran, unknown to Trump. Who's running this, and what's the policy? I mean, and this is why Iran finds it very hard to trust what's happening, to know where is Trump really serious about a deal? Can he sell it in Washington to the Israeli firsters in Washington, in Congress, in the institutional leadership, in the deep state, or not? Because on that depends whether Iran can take a risk. Otherwise, why would it take a risk? Because what it means is another 10, 15 years of being, if you like, caught up in a prison. I mean, they will be imprisoned by sanctions, by electronic means, by their access to the financial systems for another 15 years. It's a high cost. And what's the way out? At the end of those 10 years, are they released from prison? I mean, it's not clear what happens. What's the vision? You can't just put people, haven't we learned from Gaza? You can't just put a people into a fenced-off area where they have no access to the outside and say it's forever. Nothing's going to change. You don't have any vision. You don't have any prospect of release from prison. It's a very lopsided approach to a negotiation.
Well, this is a good point, though. It's often pointed out that the United States, as well as the Europeans for that sake, seem to lack some strategic thinking, but as Alistair suggests, the United States doesn't seem to be able to do negotiations either in terms of defining its clear objective and finding a way of implementing it. But given that we're not quite sure what the Americans want or how to get it, on the nuclear issue, though, what is Iran, you think, willing to give, or what is a possible meeting point? Because if the issue was no nuclear weapons, then Iran said, we're not going to have nuclear weapons, and we can have these inspections as we agreed in the JCPOA. But given that there's all these other new demands which are still unclear, what is Iran's position? How do you, of course, you're not going to reveal all your cards right now, but do you see Iran being willing to go to a certain extent to avoid a conflict, or is there concerns that Iran might embolden the United States if it gives too much?
Well, obviously I don't know what the Iranians are, what their strategy is at the negotiating table, but what Alistair was alluding to, I think, is a fundamental problem in the United States, and that is an ideological one. The United States, in my opinion, it sees itself as an exceptional state. The Europeans, in their own way, this Eurocentrism gives them special rights and privileges, and they are more civilized in their own worldview. And therefore, that makes it almost impossible for them to concede anything to the barbarians, the uncivilized, the other, whether it's Russia or Iran. I remember when the proxy war in Ukraine began, I think it was the Wall Street Journal that put a picture of President Putin on the front page and said something like, Russia goes back to its Asian roots. And he was wearing Mongolian armor, and so basically the Russians are now Mongolians, and Mongolians are, of course, this Orientalist narrative of violence and barbarism. So I think when they have this worldview, it becomes literally impossible for them to concede anything, but because conceding anything means a defeat for civilization, for the right, the just, the superior. And right now we're seeing Trump himself shifting back in Ukraine, shifting back to where Biden was. He came in, hammered the Europeans, basically said, it's none of your business, but he kept Kellogg. And Kellogg the whole time has been talking as if he's a part of the Biden administration. Gradually we're seeing Trump looking more and more like Biden. Right now he's not the same person that he was 100 days ago when he's talking about Ukraine. So how can Iran even put anything on the table? Because you don't know what the other side is. Maybe tomorrow Trump is going to take an altogether different direction. Look at Yemen. He decided to go after Yemen and defeat Ansarullah. What happened? Suddenly, last night, we discovered that he accepted a ceasefire. He fabricated the reality of the ceasefire. He presented it as if Ansarullah capitulated. I think he used that term. But he shifted completely. And now I think it's linked partially to his trip to the region. I think it's also partially because they've lost 3 F-18s, more than 20 very expensive drones. They've been spending a lot of money and they failed, and they've only killed innocent civilians. So he hasn't achieved results. But does that mean that this ceasefire is going to hold? Maybe 2 weeks from now, after he leaves the region, he will restart this war. This is the problem that we have with Trump. The trade war, right now, the tariffs have gone up to 140% or 150%. Even economists, even businessmen in the United States don't know what's going to happen. Many goods that are being in China, they're in the ships. They're waiting to see what will happen. This indecision by a person who is a businessman is totally destructive, but he's not making any decisions. He's not moving in a particular direction. So when you take all that into account, I think for the Iranians, the question is not what we can put on the table. The question is, what can we put on the table that won't come back to haunt us because we cannot trust him? So let's say some element of the nuclear program they decide to set aside, which reversing that would be costly and time-consuming. And so Iran sets it aside, let's say, just as an example. And then Trump decides 2 weeks later that he no longer wants this agreement. The Iranian nuclear program is harmed, and they get nothing for it. And also the fact is that the sanctions are not going to go away. This box that Alistair is speaking of, with or without a nuclear agreement, the Americans are not going to remove the bulk of the sanctions. Most of them go back to Congress, and Congress is not going to remove those sanctions. Just like Russia. Most of the sanctions on Russia are never going to go away. That's just not how Congress works. So when Nelson Mandela was in jail, he was a terrorist according to U.S. law, and so was the ANC. He was released from prison, he was still a terrorist. He became president, he was still a terrorist. He retired from politics, he was still a terrorist. I think it was in 2009 or 10 or so that they finally removed him from the terror list in the United States. That's how Congress works. So I don't think there's much that Trump can offer, on the one hand. So what does Iran put on the table? And then, because it's unclear where Trump is going to go tomorrow, that which the Iranians can put on the table has to be very limited, because they don't want to have an agreement which comes back to haunt them. It's very difficult. I feel that the Iranian negotiators are really, they really can't count on anything coming from Washington under these circumstances.
It's interesting this that the Trump administration, they do this deliberately. They actually said many times that having a strategic uncertainty is a good thing because your opponents won't know what to expect. But this might be good in negotiations when you're selling real estate. But in politics, it's quite destructive. Same as with the tariffs, none of your domestic producers going to make any significant investments if they don't know what's coming down, 5-10 years down the road, or 20 minutes with Trump. And I guess it's the same with these wars, trying to negotiate, be it the conflict with Iran or the actual war with Russia.
I think this is not uncertainty. I think they portray it as such, the art of the deal. But in reality, I think this is just chaos.
No one's behind the wheel.
Yes.
Well, negotiations do become more difficult. And Alistair,
I'd just like to say something about that because I think it's important. I know that Trump is being criticized quite widely everywhere about chaos, but in terms of the economic situation, I do think he had a plan, if not a plan, a vision, that the United States needs an economic rebalancing. In truth, it was not just necessary, it was inevitable, because it was on the path either to a slow bankruptcy or a quick bankruptcy. And I know there was a team that had been working on it, Wout and other people, who was the former head of the Office of Budget Management before, have been working on it for some time. That doesn't mean it is going to succeed or it is the right plan. There are a lot of different views about this, but nonetheless there was a vision, and there were people who were looking and working and thinking it through in a very thorough way. On the foreign policy, we've now moved to the point where, he's got a divided team. So who's doing the negotiating with Russia? Trump. I mean, Trump sends a message to Putin via Witkoff, and then, as the Russians say, Mr. Putin sends a message back via Witkoff. It's not a very good way of managing a complex strategic decision making on something like Russia or Iran. That there isn't. So foreign policy is different in this case from the domestic policy, where I think Trump feels more assured and feels more confident that he has ideas. He does on tariffs. He's had these ideas for 40 years or more, and he's developed them over the time. On foreign policy, he's weak. I mean, his background is, if you like, the circles of New York. And particularly the circles associated with Israel in New York. Witkoff has no background in the region. He's a real estate man. He's obviously clever. He's obviously capable. But, you do need someone on your team. You need a team that actually... JCPOA is a hugely complex process. You can't just walk into it in the middle, pick up a few threads and say, this is new, because it's all been done before. And unless you know that and how it worked out, you can't take it forward. So again, there's a difference between his domestic and his other. And the domestic economic one is his priority, not the foreign policy, because that's what the mandate was about. It was about bringing jobs back to America. The peace, that he's a man of peace. I mean, I'm sure it sat well. Part of his constituency doesn't want forever wars, doesn't want war with Iran. The populists don't. Some people have begun to speak up about that and say that. They also don't trust the way in which they're managing the Russian business. So within the populist wing, there is a certain amount of pushback coming. And the factor of all of this is, the confidence in Israel has been declining sharply. The polls have shown, even amongst that generation, particularly amongst young, it's changed. But even amongst the older generation, who watched that film Exodus and are pro-Israeli, even for them, what they see in Gaza is unbearable. And so it is changing. Is it going to be enough to bring about a fundamental change in the paradigm regarding Iran, away from the sort of siege idea that Iran can be just kept contained in a siege for now and forevermore, as Israel would like, or neutered? We have to wait and see. But the point is, it's not about 3.67 enrichment, 20% enrichment. It's about what is the balance of power in Washington, whether if Trump is capable of, if you like, bringing this to a normalization or not.
Well, yeah, the domestic economic issues. I do have some empathy there, because everyone seems to recognize it was going the wrong direction, yet nobody wants a disruption to the status quo.
Yeah.
But I want to ask on the foreign policy issue. This is another nice comparison between Russia and Iran. That is, one doesn't always get the impression that Trump is willing to take into consideration the security concern of the opponent. I mean, both as Al-Sukuk argued, many people are waking up now to what's happening in Gaza, but yet nobody wants to address the actual grievances of Iran. No one wants to discuss what has been done to Iran over the past 45 years, especially. No, we will go much further back, 53. Nobody wants to talk about Syria, Gaza, what's happening in Yemen. We see something similar in Russia. No one wants to discuss whether or not this was a good European security architecture to just gradually march NATO towards Russian borders. Yet it seems that all negotiations, what the US is willing to give in return is maybe some sanction relief, which probably won't come anyway. So will stop punishing you if you do as you're told. But how do you explain this lack of recognition, though, for the security concerns of their opponents? Is this just ignorance, or is this a hegemonic impulse that we don't care about what others want, or how do you interpret this?
The arrogance of power. I think that to a large degree, as I said earlier, it is ideological, but I also think that they are still stuck in the past. I think these people still see the world as it was in the 1990s and three decades ago, the end of history, as Alistair alluded to briefly earlier on, and they can't recognize that they don't recognize that how fast the world is changing. So Alistair was speaking about putting people in a box, putting Iran in a box, putting Gaza in a box, suffocating people. But what the United States has done, because it is unwilling to even give concessions to it right now, it has multiple problems. Internal issues aside, it has Russia, it has Iran, it has China, alongside its other issues. Iran meaning West Asia, the resistance. It's unwilling to even make sacrifices or concessions for even one of these three in order to put more pressure on the other two. You would think that Trump, if he wanted to put more pressure on the axis of resistance and on Iran, that he would succeed, or he would be highly motivated to come to some sort of rapprochement with Russia, or to at least to ease tensions, to give the concessions that Russia demands to end this, so that he could focus on Iran and on China, or the other way around. But he won't do that. He simultaneously is unwilling to step back, whether it's because he's weak, whether it's because because we don't know who Trump really is. I don't know what he's going to say tomorrow about any of these issues. But whether he's weak, whether he's under pressure, whether it's the people around him are divided, whether it's all of these together, he can't make these decisions. He's unwilling to do so. And I think that is because the United States just does not want to concede ground. Even though the U.S. Secretary of State recently spoke about a multipolar order, whatever that means, I don't think he really believes it. That's just lip service. But at the end of the day, it's America. Trump even said, I think I didn't see this myself, but apparently he said that he's sort of like ruling the world and he enjoys it. They see it that way, even if they don't believe it. That's what they say it to one another. The media says it. It's repeated. It's this echo chamber, and maybe I'm inside that echo chamber. Maybe I don't really believe it, but that's what everyone else is saying. So I sort of repeat the same statements.